How are we doing tonight? Good? All right, make sure everyone's awake. So I want you to think back. What kind of student were you, or are you? Were you hardworking, inspired, lazy, a procrastinator? I know there's some of you out there. See, the work that students produce, we often believe that's what tells us who they are as students or what kind of students they will be in our classes. But as teachers and professors know, most students, like all of us, are dealing with a complex set of issues as they progress through school. This could be especially true for certain types of students. For instance, racial minorities, undocumented students, socioeconomically disadvantaged students, LGBT students, etc. And often, we tend to try to understand those who are different from us, basing it off of stereotypes, or we relegate it to one or two obvious categories, such as he is African American and male, she is female and Asian. It's easier this way, albeit lazy and often problematic. This happens to me sometimes in the classroom as an English professor. In fact, one day in class, a student looked at me and asked, "Are you a conservative Republican?" I looked back with a little bit of confusion and said, "Why would you say that?" She quickly responded, "You look like a Republican." Now, I didn't know there was a dress code, but apparently there is. So sometimes students are often interested in my life beyond the classroom. And since I wear a ring, they sometimes will ask me, "Are you married?" And I usually respond with a simple yes. Then sometimes a more personal question follows. "What is your wife's name?" Now, depending on my mood, I'll look out onto the class and say, "Carlos." Okay, see, Carlos is actually my husband's name. What my students have inadvertently done is put me in a position to either lie to them or come out on the spot. They don't mean to do this, of course, but the very nature of the question demands it. Now, this is a symptom of what we call heteronormativity. Excuse me. And in the context of the classroom, I'm in a position of authority and have very little fear of reprisal from my own students. However, what if I were 18 or 19, dealing with the complexities of being in the closet, not having friends or family support, all the while trying to get through school? How might this affect my academic success? So this is the question I want to pose to you tonight. How do we teach to what I'm calling hidden identities, or students with identities who are not obvious through their appearance? So I'm going to look at two examples right now of students who come to mind when I think of this. The first student came to me after class one day. She wanted to talk about her paper, which was focused on immigration. We will call her Brenda. So Brenda began discussing her paper, and it quickly evolved into a discussion about her own personal life. See, when Brenda started applying for college, she began to ask her parents questions. This led to a conversation. She revealed to me that she was brought over here from Mexico when she was 2 years old, and unbeknownst to her, she was actually undocumented until that moment. You can imagine that this was both shocking and quite dismaying to her. In addition, and even to make things more complicated, her father was not supportive of her attending college. He wanted her to either work or get married. Now, I was not aware of this until she verbalized it to me. Let's look at another example. I had a student come to me at the beginning of class one semester. We will call him Alex. Alex told me that he suffers from an anxiety disorder and that he may need to periodically leave class from time to time if it, quote, became too much to handle. I said that was fine and we worked it out together. As the semester progressed and he became more comfortable, he shared more information. Alex is also gay. He struggles with housing because when he came out to his family, they were unfortunately not supportive. In addition, Alex is also Latino and Catholic. The only recognizable aspect of his identity is his identity. Everything else was either hidden or not easily recognizable to me as his instructor. Now, what's interesting, not only did Brenda and Alex both have hidden identities, but aspects of their identities were actually in conflict with one another. This conflict created inner turmoil and added extra barriers and obstacles to their education. So, tonight I'm going to propose to you 3 simple tips just to begin to address this. The first is addressing our own implicit biases. The second, using inclusive language. And thirdly, using diverse and inclusive curriculum whenever possible. So let's start with number one, addressing our own biases. Now, I hate to admit it, but teachers and professors are humans just like everyone else, and we are susceptible to stereotypes and prejudices just like everyone else. When we look out upon our classes at the beginning of the semester of hopefully eager students, we sometimes categorize them based on visual cues, such as race or gender or appearance or dress and the like. It's human nature after all. However, we tend to warn our students about this. We know it's problematic. In fact, visual cues can mislead us. This was the case with Brenda. I believe Brenda was an American-born citizen based on the fact that she had perfect English and she had knowledge of American references in my class. However, little did I know that Brenda was struggling even with staying in school due to the fact that she didn't believe she could actually get a job after she graduated due to her immigration status. Sometimes the biases that we bring into classes can affect the way that we speak to students. We can tend to use exclusionary or even sometimes offensive language, even if it's unintentional. So that brings me to number two, using inclusive language. So this can come in many forms, okay? Now, I've witnessed this, unfortunately, sometimes in a classroom when I visited different classrooms. Let's take an example. Let's say an instructor in a class states to her class, quote, "You men in the class who will marry and find a wife, you're going to encounter communication problems with her." Now, this was actually an interesting conversation about gender communication. However, what the instructor has done is potentially isolate groups of students in her class. What about the gay male students? What about lesbian students? What about transgender students? Do they feel welcome in that class discussion? Do they dare verbalize their point of view in fear of outing themselves, which can be either embarrassing or even dangerous, depending on the context of the class? Let's take another example. Let's say an instructor is talking about a novel, and he states, quote, "This character..." Now, this may be benign or even humorous in a certain context. However, what if some of his students are dealing with psychological issues, and they understand the word nuts as applying to them? Do they feel safe in that class? Do they feel welcome? How might this affect their productivity as students? So sometimes it's about the language that we use in a classroom. Let's return to our examples and see what we could do. Let's go back to number one. The instructor could have said instead, quote, "For those of you who will be in a long-term relationship or marry someone of the opposite sex, you may encounter communication problems with them." And then she could have followed up with a discussion about different types of couples or different types of relationships. Let's look at the second one. That instructor could have refocused the conversation a little bit and avoided offensive or exclusionary language. He could have said, quote, "This character is showing symptoms of schizophrenia, so let's discuss how that affects his interactions with other characters in the novel." So what this does is avoids the word nuts, which could possibly be offensive, and also actually refocuses the discussion itself. So let's look at number three, using diverse and inclusive curriculum whenever possible. Now, as an English instructor, I assign lots of readings, much to the chagrin of some of my students in a class. This is a great opportunity to incorporate diversity in classes. So what I try to do is incorporate lots of different backgrounds, different racial minorities, cultural backgrounds, genders, sexual orientations, geographic regions, et cetera, et cetera. I'm surprised semester after semester how students aren't exposed to a variety of voices in their classroom. This can make them feel less isolated and more engaged in the material and the class itself. To see someone of their own background or identity who has used his or her voice successfully. I would have personally been so grateful to have read an openly gay author in high school and actually have the teacher discuss how the sexual identity of the author affected his or her writing. However, there are other ways to be inclusive in our classes. Think about the textbooks that we use. What about the illustrations and examples? Are they mostly white heterosexual couples or individuals? Think about the discussions we have in class. how do we introduce those topics in class? How do we navigate or facilitate the discussions we have in class? What about the discussion questions that we actually ask? Where do they lead the students? So there are lots of different ways that we can be inclusive and welcoming within our classes. Now, as teachers and professors, we may not always know the hidden or even conflicting identities of our students. But what we can control and what we can create are environments within our classes that are hopefully inclusive, welcoming, safe, and hopefully allow our students to flourish. However, students who are dealing with hidden or conflicting identities are most likely dealing with extra barriers or obstacles in their education. They tend to be more prone to dropping a class, failing a class, postponing their education, or dropping out of school altogether. So when you think back to the type of student you were or are, remember, not all students who are struggling in their education are considered bad or lazy. They may just be dealing with the obstacles of their hidden or conflicting identities. And as I tell you this tonight, I'm very happy to report both Brenda and Alex have graduated with bachelor's degrees, and they serve as reminders to me that our diligence as educators can and will make an impact on our students' lives. Thank you.